Hi, my name is Steve Ruiz, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies at Cal State Northridge. I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about environmental justice, but I'm going to be talking about different approaches that I like to use in the classroom using the digital humanities. Now, I know very often people have been talking about what digital humanities is, and there's kind of debates about its kind of recent emergence. But the cool thing about the digital humanities is it actually provides different techniques and tools for not only teaching, but also to teach students how to do research and to make this hopefully something that is kind of life transforming in terms of environmental justice. So let me go ahead and begin. First, I just want to say that the digital humanities is an interdisciplinary field that basically requires or encompasses a broad range of software, tools, coding, mapping software that ranges anywhere from GIS to using story maps and digital technology as ways of illustrating humanistic experiences in the classroom, but also through labs. So one of the things that I did this past semester is I had a chance to work with my students and my more senior undergraduate students on this environmental digital humanities lab. And the reason why we called it that is because we were using archival information pertaining to my book manuscript project. And I wanted to get my students involved in seeing how is it that these new technologies can be useful for them, but also can kind of reset the boundaries of research and kind of cutting edge technology, but it can be very useful for them in their own professionalization process. So one of the things that I did is we were interested in understanding and documenting the Mexican American experience in the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this is something that had arose out of my own research that I had done at the National Archives. And what we were more interested in, though, is what is the particular relationship between Latinos and the great outdoors? And how has this defined and recreated certain boundaries around access to the national park system, U.S. Forest Service, and how have these boundaries been crossed historically by Latinos in the United States? So I was really interested in understanding how is it the experiences of Mexican Americans has been historicized, but what lessons can we learn from these experiences using the digital humanities? So just some of the things that we were able to do as student-professor collaboration is under the sponsorship of the College of Humanities, we actually have a digital humanities lab. And what that does is it allows the students to have a space where they conventionally don't actually even think that they can have a lab. So for one, the idea of having a research lab is kind of extraordinary, even unique for the humanities, because it's not something that we normally are trained in as students or even as professors. But second, when we do have these labs, how is it that we can highlight and encompass the human experiences of people of color and their interactions with the environment and how they have shaped their environments in positive ways, and despite overcoming certain obstacles such as racial bias, racial discrimination, and in the context of the Civilian Conservation Corps, this is one of the perhaps most interesting and significant parts of thinking about Latinos' relationship to conservation movements. Now, historically, conservation movements, the way we kind of think about them in EJ or environmental justice, is that these are thought of as mainstream environmental movements that precede the real environmental justice movements of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Now, what's interesting is my students were interested in is, well, what history do Latinos have in their relationship in the creation of national parks and the creation of Forest Service? And one of the things we were able to do is actually go through archives using digitized scanned copies of records from the National Archives. So we had taken records that I had taken last year and last summer from the CCC records. And what we were interested in is seeing what students could do with that information from a visual perspective. Now, what they did is they were able to create these mind maps, and using mind map software really articulate a different way of learning information from the archive. And so some of the things we were able to do creatively is to collaborate with one another in the lab and create these really interesting mind maps where people could code information but connect things using certain themes that they were finding in the archives. And some of these themes, for example, included racial segregation, issues pertaining to misuse of funds, to a lack of food, to a lack of shelter for Mexican Americans who had volunteered to be a part of the CCC. And the reason why we thought that this was such an interesting story to tell is because many of our students themselves either felt compelled to really draw a relationship or a line to reimagining Latinos' relationship to the great outdoors. And some of the lessons they learned was that Mexican Americans, since the beginning of the national park system, have always been at the forefront of conservation movements. Even though they were denied sometimes full civil rights in these camps, they were actually also able to reinvent their relationship to national parks by their participation. And this is actually something that's kind of an untold hidden story in the history of the CCC. And second, we were also interested in understanding how is this relevant to the community today. And so this is actually another component where I wanted to show that as teachers and as professors, one of the things that we can do is the digital technology can do so much, but it can also allow us to collaborate and to work alongside with community members. And so one of the things that we were able to do this past year is we were able to network with a hacking group actually called Map Times LA. And we invited this group of folks to come in and assist us in thinking about digital humanities from a mapping perspective. And what we were able to do is locate different access points and look at directly on the map in Los Angeles County what proximity Angelinos, especially Latino Angelinos, have and access to the national parks and to the U.S. Forest Service. So some of the things we've been working on, for example, is highlighting certain pollution burden indexes that some Latinos face that are much higher than other areas of the city. Additionally, this is significant research because we're finding that some of the barriers that people have in gaining access to the national park system requires that we actually understand some of the conditions and real lived experiences that people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, such as transportation barriers, low income access, and also things like language translation into Spanish. These are all kind of some of the barriers that we witnessed. And these were inspired by the historical work that my students were doing, where they really wanted to find and reinvent what are some challenges and problem-solving techniques we can overcome as a society. And additionally, the third kind of thing that I wanted to mention is in our Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies, we've actually been working directly with the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service to collaborate on different internships, pathways, and new inspiring work where we really want to outreach to the community to see if there's an interest on the part of the community. We know that some of the biggest consumers or patrons of the national parks is growing and has been growing astronomically is within the Latino demographic. This means something. This means that the demography of our city is changing, of our county and our state and our nation. And that also means that because of the transformative possibilities of this population coming in and changing the character of citizens' relationships to the national parks, that we also have a responsibility to accommodate to them. And that means uh, part of that means is their inclusion into the national history of the national parks, so that there's cultural relevancy made on the part of the national parks to these communities, so that they can see themselves reflected in the landscape of the national park story. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, and I don't want to jump around too much, but I do want to say that the story of the national parks is important because it not only highlights, yes, histories of discrimination and racial segregation that occurred in camps, but some of the things that were most inspiring on the part from my students is that the digital humanities was provided them a gateway to really think and network with one another as students, to collaborate with community members. So, for example, my students had also conducted service learning projects where they were able to talk to community members and see what on the ground and assess what are some of the barriers that our communities face in terms of environmental injustice. And I think this is important from another reasons. Politically, our climate is changing in astronomical ways. There are people that are deniers of climate change, that deny that the scientific fact that our world and our ecosystem are changing dramatically and having a negative impact on not only human populations but other species. And this is significant for a number of reasons, because we have to think about the future generation that is going to inherit a planet that not only is going to have to deal with decisions over economic power, but whether we contribute and really think of ourselves as interconnected to the planet and our ecosystem, and how we treat and reflect, and how we treat our Earth is a reflection of how we treat and really hold dear our ecosystem. Now, additionally, I want to kind of also say is that there is a great interest in the Latino community to talk about planetary issues, to talk about climate change, and there is a growing democratic movement in these communities that cannot be stopped by government policies that try to sideswipe or try to undermine the advancements of the environmental justice movement. It can't be stopped, and the reasons why is because it is a grassroots movement. There are organizations that my students were working with, such as nonprofits, working alongside folks that were rebuilding and replanting green spaces, planting trees, taking folks who were from urban centers who had never visited a park, national park, and taking them out in the outdoors. And some of our students themselves come from these same neighborhoods, and they talk about how exciting and how important environmental justice is. And the reason why is because they themselves have talked about that they had never been exposed to things like hiking, even though they grew up in Los Angeles County. Additionally, many of our students share that there was just a lack of knowledge about the accessibility and the fact that the national parks are at such close spatial proximity. So there's a number of things that are going on that are changing and continuing to change. And this is actually what I want to say is why change is positive and important and significant. The Latino population is growing at an astronomical rate. By 2030, they're predicted to be nearly at 20 to 30% of the U.S. demographic population. And with that means that people are bringing new techniques and new technologies and new innovative practices that have to be recognized and honored. Immigrants and Native people have been long practitioners of building strong relationships to the environment. And that is in our cultural heritage historically. Every group has built certain types of relationships to land around them and their ecosystems. And we have to honor the fact that there are new demographics of people coming in, and they're making positive change. And in fact, I would argue that they are going to be at the forefront of some of the most decisive issues that are going to really save our planet. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the actual work and labor that is being done to for energy conservation